Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Saoirse Healey, and tonight I'm joined in the studio by Professor John W. Robertson, a former lecturer at UWS. John, good evening. How are you?
Good evening, I'm well. Yourself?
I'm very well, thank you. So we'll, as we always do, we'll move on to the Ukrainian update. It is day 358 of the Ukrainian war. Russia has launched its latest wave of missile strikes on Ukraine in the early hours of this morning. A total of 36 air and sea-based cruise missiles, guided air-to-surface missiles, and anti-ship missiles were launched at Ukraine overnight into Thursday, according to Ukrainian officials. The overnight bombardment did not have a major impact on power, Ukraine's energy minister, German Gulushchenko, and the national power grid operator, Ukrenegro, said. Russian forces are mounting round-the-clock attacks on the Ukrainian position in the east. Ukraine's deputy minister, Hanna Malia, has said, the situation is tense. Yes, it is difficult for us, Malia posted to Telegram on Wednesday. The situation in Luhansk remained difficult, President Volodymyr Zelensky's office said, without mentioning any retreats in eastern Ukraine. Russia is sending heavily armed equipment and mobilized troops to the Luhansk region, but Ukrainian forces continue to defend the eastern Ukrainian region, its governor Serhiy Haidai has said. Russia's equipment and manpower are likely significantly depleted, says the Institute for the Study of War in its latest updates. Russia continues to introduce large numbers of troops to the battlefield in Ukraine. The US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has said, neither Russia nor Ukraine is likely to achieve their military aims, according to Jean-Marc Milley, chair of the America's Joint Chiefs of Staff. Israel's Foreign Minister Eli Cohen arrived in Kyiv on Thursday to meet with President Zelensky in the first public visit to the Ukrainian capital by a senior Israeli official since Russia's invasion. Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has said that he would only order his troops to fight alongside ally Russia if another country launches an attack against Belarus. President Zelensky has ruled out giving up any Ukrainian territory in potential peace deal with Russia. President Zelensky has thanked Norway for agreeing to pass a bilateral aid package of about $7 billion over the past 5 years. It's the largest aid program Norway has supplied to a singular nation. EU countries are on good track to adopt new sanctions against Russia in time for the anniversary of Moscow's attack on Ukraine on the 24th of February, according to diplomatic sources. Rishi Sunak and Polish President Andrzej Duda have agreed on the importance of stepping up support to Ukraine in the coming weeks. John, what do you make of the latest updates on the Ukrainian situation? Do you think there'll be a decrease in the tensions anytime soon, or do you think that this war will be ongoing for a significant amount of time?
It's not looking very promising, is it? It's looking as if Putin is determined to keep it going. Despite the successes that the Ukrainians have had and the heavy losses that the Russians seem to have suffered, Putin seems determined to keep going. He's a very disturbing character, and I'm sure historians will look back on him in a similar light to people like Hitler and Stalin and so on. But I see no signs of an easy finish. The West will continue to arm them, and they'll continue to score points, to score victories over the Russians. But I don't know. I think we can only hope for a regime change in Russia as the only way out of this.
Yeah, there's all the rumors and the reports that Putin's ill and that there's divisions in within the Russian government. So you never know.
Yes, well, they have. I'm sure they have other psychopaths rather than Putin who can step in and unfortunately carry on the same kind of campaign. There has to be some motive for them to give up, and it may be that the West has some role here in offering some kind of compromise here.
if Putin leaves, will the person who follows him be any worse as well? There's that as well.
Well, that's right. We have no idea.
No idea. So moving on from Ukraine to Syria, there is growing anger in the northwest of Syria as survivors feel forgotten by the world and have particular scorn for the UN's dealings with Assad. The UN announced on Monday that it had won the approval of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to open border crossings into the opposition-held northwest. Jindiris is a town that was home to displaced people from all corners of Syria, especially those who defied Assad and had been forced into exile as a result. Tarek Ammar was one of them. Assad is worse than the earthquake, he said, and the UN is killing us more by its policy towards Bashar. We don't need to wait for them to open the borders. They are already open. Why are people asking for their permission? The first non-scheduled aid convoy crossed the border at Bab al-Assam on Tuesday, carrying tents, medicines, and blankets, a speck in the collective needs of the province ravaged by the suffering more over the past decade than most other places in the Middle East. Muaz Mustafa, the executive director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, said that the UN announcement was redundant and drew on narrow and bitterly contested interpretations of international law. Along the road to Jureidis, near the city of Afrin, a convoy of trucks carrying aid from Saudi Arabia had parked up. Flags announcing Qatari deliveries flew nearby. NGOs active in the province have also distributed relief from pre-existing stockpiles. Frustrated NGOs are deeply critical of the piecemeal global response, and the readiness, even now, to defer to Assad hangs in a pall over the region. In hospitals, medicine and morale are running low. Afrin Hospital, one of the region's biggest, received 750 patients, many of them badly injured or dying in the hours after the earthquake. Many were children, and up to 15 of whom required amputations. Now, moving on to Glasgow, the Glasgow City Council has met today to agree its budget for 2023 to 24. The budget, despite the Labour Party members walking out of the meetings. The city's treasurer, Ricky Bell, said that although the budget was deeply imperfect, was necessary to respond to the most turbulent economic, financial context that most people can remember. SNP councillors criticised opposition groups who did not put forward any alternative propositions, saying that the SNP did not have the luxury of throwing our hands up in the air and walking away. Council tax is set to increase by 5%, meaning a Band D household will now pay £1,499. Other measures approved to help reduce the £49 million funding shortfall include an increase in parking charges and fines, and permit charges are to be introduced for garden and food waste. The council will also use £6 million from its reserves. SNP group leader Susan Aitken said earlier that there would have to be some job cuts, but ruled out any compulsory redundancies. Now, John, do you think that the measures that are proposed by the Glasgow City Council, do you think this is doing enough?
Well, I don't actually know the detail of what they're planning, but it strikes me that we've seen in recent days the Institute for Fiscal Studies praising the Scottish Government for its more progressive taxation, which, as the First Minister mentioned yesterday, means that the poorest in our society with children, anyway with children in particular, are £2,000 a year better off in Scotland than they would be in England. I think that's a major achievement. And I think the message is there for the local councils as well. I speak as somebody who pays council tax, but I think the way to deal with this is also to deal with it progressively, and that's to increase council tax in the higher bands as a way of increasing the revenue and providing the revenue to avoid these kind of cuts. That seems to me the only fair way to do it.
Absolutely. So they say that they're doing a 3% increase in the council tax. Would you rather see a smaller band for the lower incomes, and then it progressively get even higher for the like higher economic
It's the only,
levels?
it's the only fair way. It's the only fair way. Those who can afford to pay in these difficult times, those who can afford to pay should pay, and those who
Mhm.
can't afford to pay for it need to be protected. I think we're working towards, a better nation here, and the S&P have done a very good job within the constraints that they face. They've done a very good job in improving the nature of taxation, making it more fair and more progressive. I think that's the way to go. It's the only way to go.
Mhm. And so the legacy that Glasgow's had to face to do with equal wages to close up the gender pay gap, what do you think that the council is able to do about that?
Well, I think that's a reason to be angry. That's a reason to be angry about what the Labour Party have done in the past in Glasgow. They're clearly misogynistic sort of policies in the past, and now they're deep hypocrisy in trying to blame the Scottish Government for the situation that they created. But I'm afraid that's the past now. I mean, I think we have to just say, well, that was terrible, and we need to remember that when we consider ever voting for the Labour Party again. But I think the only way forward now is through progressive taxation until we reach a point where, with full independence, we can actually borrow, as most normal countries were able to do to deal with difficult circumstances. Ireland will borrow to deal with its difficulties. That's what any normal country would do.
Hmm. Absolutely. Okay, so we'll move on. So the SNP has called for the UK government to cut household energy bills after the Centrica profits were announced. Centrica chief executive Chris O'Shea has refused to say whether he will waive the £1.6 million bonus as the British and Scottish gas parent company saw its annual profits triple to a record £3.3 billion against the backdrop of the cost of living crisis. The company's monster profits angered campaigners who are calling for tougher windfall taxes, lower bills, and better treatment of vulnerable customers against the backdrop of the prepayment meter scandal. O'Shea could land a pay package of more than £3 million, including an annual bonus of as much as £1.6 million. He refused to say whether he would repeat last year's actions when he waived the £1.1 million bonus, given the hardships faced by our customers. Centrica will also dish out about £750 million in rewards to shareholders. The company will spend a further £300 million on buying back its own shares on top of a previously announced £250 million share buyback. British Gas faced widespread criticism earlier this month when it emerged that debt agents working for Britain's largest energy supplier had ignored customers' vulnerabilities and forced them onto prepayment meters to recover debts. Responding to the news of Centrica's profits, the SNP have repeated calls for the UK government to cut household energy bills by at least 20% as energy company profits continue to soar. Centrica are the latest energy company following BP, Shell, and Exxon to report record profits. However, the UK government has refused to consider expanding the windfall tax or tax the billions of pounds funneled back through share buybacks. Despite the profits, household energy bills are set to rise, with the UK government planning to increase the energy price guarantee by 20% from £2,500 to £3,000. Sorry, £2,500 to £3,000 for typical annual consumption. In March, the £400 energy bill support scheme, a crucial lifeline for struggling households, will also be scrapped. The SNP Energy and Industrial Strategy spokesperson Alan Brown said, "The Tories have it in their power to significantly cut energy bills and relieve the financial strain placed on the households through their cost of living crisis, but have instead allowed millions of families to suffer, all while energy companies post record profits. Now, John, what do you make of this? Is this just free market capitalism in action, or should the government be stepping in to limit this?
It is free market capitalism in operation, laissez-faire free market capitalism. The governments have a role to actually protect the public from the abuses of free market capitalism. Free market capitalism is like a tiger, it's difficult to ride. But let me, rather than quoting any prominent economist, let me quote an very old song. The very thing that makes you rich makes me poor. You cannot make that level of riches, the major profits that Shell, BP, and now Centrica are making. These are made on the backs of the poor. These are not profits made from their cleverness or their policies or their strategies or their new technologies. These are profits made because they're charging the people who can barely afford to pay, they're charging them more. And governments have a responsibility to protect the people. But this one in Westminster doesn't care.
Absolutely. And so Westminster, they're not going to do anything. Do you think that there's anything without independence that the Scottish government is able to do to put limits on these things, or we just have to wait to see if independence comes?
Well, I think that's certainly true. I mean, the Scottish government have done a certain amount. I mean, but they're massively constrained in terms of what they can do. They don't have, as they say, the levers of control over the economy. I mean, and we do know that there have been successes. I mean, poverty is at a lower level in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK. Child poverty is significantly lower in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK. Public services are operating better across the board. Crime, health, you name it. Public services are operating better in Scotland. But to really solve the problem, because we still have the shame of poverty. We still have the shame of too long waiting times and so on. The only way has to be control, to be like a normal country, to be Ireland or Denmark.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, moving on, Standard Chartered bankers will receive their biggest bonuses since the financial crisis. After rising global interest rates pushed the lenders' profits up 28%. The London headquartered bank said it had increased staff bonuses by 16% to a total of $1.6 billion in light of the fact that the bank had performed strongly even amid ongoing external challenges, including the war in Ukraine. It is the largest bonus pool since at least 2009, according to data disclosed in Standard Chartered's annual reports, surpassing the $1.4 billion pool distributed to bankers in 2013. The increase in payouts also benefited the chief executive, Bill Winters, whose pay rose 16% to $5.5 million for 2022, thanks to a $2.5 million bonus that rose in line with profits. That marks his biggest payout since he joined Standard Chartered in 2015, having been paid $12.8 million that year thanks to a share buyout plan meant to compensate him for quitting the hedge fund that he was previously running. Now, John, we were just talking about, you mentioned what makes you rich makes me poor. As a former academic, in the context of the UCU strikes and teachers striking for fairer pay, how does this make you feel to see the huge bonuses that bankers are seeing and teachers and academics are having to fight just for a pay rise to in line with inflation?
Well, I mean, it's not just that. I mean, the inequality in this country is becoming quite shocking. And the important thing about that is, to my mind, is that the arguments made by right-wing economists and by the Conservative Party are along the lines that this will somehow enable us to keep the best talent, and that will somehow be good for the economy that people get these massive bonuses. But any basic understanding of economics tells you that if you allow the less well-off, the poor, if you allow them a little more income, they will spend every penny, and every penny will then go into manufacturing or into services, and the economy will be boosted. If you give more money to the already rich, they will tuck it away in offshore accounts, and it will lie there doing nothing for the economy. And so, it's just an appalling misunderstanding of what's good for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so that would essentially be a return to the Keynesian economics that we saw post 1945. Do you think that would be the kind of
Yeah.
ideal?
I mean, in the US and in Britain, as late as the late 1960s, the top rate of tax was to some extent through the roof. It was up at 70 to 90%, depending on where you were and what the Beatles complained. I remember in their song "Taxman" because they were hardly getting anything from the income they were generating. But that was the norm until the Thatcher Reagan era. The world was improving. The conditions of working people were improving, and the opportunities for working class people were improving because tax was properly progressive. Regardless of the moans of the super rich, it was working, and it was good for all of them because the super rich they can actually live better in a more equal society. In an unequal society, they'll have to live in compounds to keep out, drug addicts and the criminals and so on. They make the world worse for themselves too, by their greed.
Almost like, would you say that the neoliberalism has
Yeah.
destroyed that kind of fair level of capitalism that is portrayed within like the American dream, because it's
Yeah,
just impossible to
that's
achieve
right.
anymore?
And in Britain after the war, I mean, there were tremendous improvements in terms of the actual quality of life. If you leave out technical sophistication, we have better cars, we have mobile phones, and all these things today. We have the internet, but in terms of the quality of life, in terms of opportunities, free higher education, access to housing, benefits, and so on, the best year in British history was 1976, and things have got worse since then for the average person.
Yeah. Well, hopefully one
I'm
day
getting
soon they'll
I'm
upturn.
getting wound up here.
Hopefully one day soon we'll see the neoliberal order overturned a little bit, or at least constrained,
Written.
So moving on to international news, Israel has passed a legislation allowing the state to strip Arabs convicted of terror offenses of citizenship or residency and deport them to the West Bank or the Gaza Strip if they have received financial aid from the Palestinian Authority. The new law, which the Knesset voted for yesterday, is designed to discourage Israeli Arab citizens from accepting financial support from the Palestinian Authority for the families of people in prison. Israel describes the support as a pay for slay stipends and says that the payments are an incentive to commit violence. It is inconceivable that Israeli citizens and residents who have not only betrayed the state and Israeli society, but have also agreed to receive payments from the PA as wages for committing acts of terrorism will continue to benefit from it, will continue to hold Israeli citizenship or residency status, an explanatory note to the bill says. Now, the decision could affect 140 citizens of Israel with Palestinian heritage and 211 Palestinians from East Jerusalem with Israeli residency permits who are currently held in jail, according to the Israeli rights group Hamok. Sorry, hard pronunciation. The deportation of people from East Jerusalem, which Israel annexed in 1967, would be considered a war crime under international law, and critics have said that the new measures amount to population transfer. Jewish members of the Knesset, including the opposition, voted overwhelmingly in favor of the legislation, which passed 94 to 10, while Arab lawmakers voted against it. Ahmad Tibi, the leader of the opposition Tal Party, which advocates for the rights of Israel's Arab minority, said that the bill was racist because it did not apply to Jews convicted of terrorism. Now, John, is this just another example of Israeli aggression towards the Arab population?
Well, I mean, I hesitate to say too much about Israel Palestine. You have to be careful what you say these days. I mean, if you criticise Israel too much, you're accused of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, what? I mean, it's hell on earth there for the Palestinian people, and the West really doesn't have the will to do anything about it. I don't think it could. I think the Israeli government is now so strong. I mean, it has nuclear weapons. It's a strong economy. I don't think anyone, not even Americans now, could particularly influence them. What we're seeing is ethnic cleansing here, and it looks as if it's heading towards complete ethnic cleansing eventually.
Yeah, it's definitely it's no longer just an agent of the US as it kind of used to be in the Middle East. It's definitely on its own 2 feet, whether that's the right wing members of the government and everything like that. So we'll move over to Spain. The Spanish Parliament has approved a new law that will allow anyone over 16 to change their legally registered gender, ease abortion limits for those aged 16 and 17, and make the country the first in Europe to introduce paid menstrual leave. The new transgender law, which was passed despite protests from gender critical feminist groups and socially conservative opposition parties, means that anyone aged over 16 will be able to change their gender on official documents without medical supervision. A judge will need to authorize the change for minors aged between 12 and 14, while those aged between 14 and 16 will need the consent of their parents or guardians. The law will also see a ban on conversion therapy, punishable by hefty fines, and an end to public subsidies for groups that incite or promote LGBTI phobia. The new abortion legislation repeals a law that required women aged 16 and 17 to obtain parental consent for abortions. This was introduced by the Conservative People's Party in 2015. It also scraps the requirement for a 3-day period of reflection for those seeking a termination and aims to make it far easier for women to access abortions in public hospitals and clinics. Today's vote also introduced up to 5 days of menstrual leave for women who have incapacitating periods. According to the Spanish Gynecological and Obstetric Society, a third of women experience dysmorphia or painful menstruation. Accompanying measures include the free provision of free sanitary products in schools, prisons, and women's centers to tackle period poverty. Now, John, just to throw this to you, do you see this? So obviously Scotland, the gender reform bill that was struck down by Westminster, do you think that they'll move to it a little bit more now that there's a European precedent for a bill like that?
Well, I think it was in Scotland. It was clearly a cynical political act. I don't think the people who moved towards the blocking of the Scottish reforms, I don't think they cared at all about the interests of women. I think they were merely concerned with trying to score a point over the Scottish government. It's pleasing to hear what's happening in Spain, and it's an achievement in Spain. It's a country with a long history of oppression by the church, by religious bodies denying progressive change. So really quite an achievement in Spain, and it's another example of how things are being done in other parts of Europe, which somehow seem to be a problem in Scotland, but only in Scotland. We have deposit schemes for bottles operating all over the world, all over Europe, and yet somehow Scotland can't have it. We're told that Scotland must wait for a UK-wide deposit scheme, despite the fact that Belgium has devolved deposit schemes. And the same applies to the gender recognition. This is This is something that's being dealt with progressively in other parts of Europe, and there is no reason why Scotland shouldn't just do the same.
Mhm. So would you say it was the blocking the bill was merely just a conservative move to prevent Scotland's rise, or do you think it was they knew that it could be used as an argument for independence when they blocked it?
I don't think probably they thought there was much use in regard to the general independence debate. But I think it was seen as a convenient way of trying to undermine the Scottish government, and in particular the First Minister. I mean, that was I don't believe that was the reason why the First Minister has resigned. But you have to say it must have been part of an accumulation of constant sort of irritation for her and depressing cynicism. I mean, how could you keep going day after day after day when your opponents behave in such a bestial manner, quite honest, caring not at all about principles, but only about some kind of cheap attempt to score points and hopefully, lead to heads rolling.
I know I couldn't imagine. Do you think that should a man be elected as the next first minister, do you think they'll behave in the same kind of way as they have done for years with Nicola Sturgeon?
Um, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Um, I mean, I see in the opinion polls that Angus Robertson, a white man, is the favourite to succeed. I don't know what's going to happen. And I would love Jean Freeman to come back and be the first minister. I think Jean Freeman would make a great first minister. But I think she's had enough as well of all the terrible abuse she got as health secretary. Must be very wearying. Even though you're a strong person, as you know, as they are, it must eventually comes a tipping point, I suppose, and you can't take any more of it. So if it was a male first minister, it may be that somehow, the media is quite misogynistic, including the so-called quality press. People like Tom Gordon, I think, might not be quite as nasty towards a male first minister. I don't know. It would be interesting to see. I'd be quite worried about some of the women who are being suggested as possible first ministers, the kind of media attention they'll be getting.
Yeah, no, I won't be signing up for that job anytime soon. I couldn't even imagine the just tirade that you would get from, as you said, the high quality press. So the moving on, the Scottish government has announced £27 million in funding for community projects tackling poverty and disadvantage for over the next 3 years. Food pantries, which help lower food bills and access to the cost of living advice services, are among the 100 initiatives developed by local people set to receive grants from the Investing in Communities Fund. Each supported project is delivering multiple activities, including debt and benefit advice to avoid electricity and gas disconnection or eviction from rent arrears in southeast Glasgow, a furniture reuse scheme in Inverness, and a swap and repair shop in West Lothian, community food growing in southwest Glasgow, school uniform exchanges and supporting parents into employment in South Lanarkshire, helping mothers establish micro businesses in southwest Edinburgh, training for job seekers, and counselling to address mental health and substance abuse issues in the Borders. Community Wealth Minister Tom Arthur said this fund will help directly address issues facing disadvantaged communities such as unemployment and food insecurity. We have been clear that the Scottish budget is prioritising our limited resources to tackle child poverty, invest in our transition to net zero, and protect public services. And support projects supported through investing in communities speak to these priorities. It's just crazy when you look at earlier in the program, we were looking at the huge bonuses from the banking, and then you have the Scottish government doing their day jobs with such a tight budget. It really puts lots of things into perspective.
Yes, this is another example of the attempts within the constraints that they face, attempts to mitigate the general austerity imposed on the whole of Britain. And I mean, people in the north of England are actually suffering even more because of their lack of devolutionary ability to mitigate. But the Scottish government spent hundreds of millions trying to mitigate problems, and when we see the results, I mean, we have more police officers per head of population and significantly lower crime overall. We have more teachers and we have more nurses per head of population. More nurses per head of population, and notably we have shorter waiting times. They're still too long, but they're shorter because we have more nurses per head of population. More doctors, and notably, not a single strike as yet in the health services in Scotland, because the Scottish government, again within the limitations, has respected the leaders of these unions, spoken to them and done their very best to try and do something about it. And we also see that a longer term strategy to actually increase tax to provide revenue ring fenced for the NHS and other public services. You know, they're doing what they can do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and they like you were saying, they operate in such a tight margin that there genuinely is only so much you can do. Do you think that the community projects that they are proposing, do you think that's where they should be putting their energy, or do you think industry and business and things like that, do you think that was a little bit neglected, or do you think the kind of plan was quite solid?
Well, I'm not an economist, so I'm glad to say I'm not an economist, a miserable science. But I mean, I don't feel in a position to really criticise or to suggest detailed changes here. I mean, the Scottish government employ very high skilled economists, I'm sure, and they make decisions on how to use these limited resources.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it sounds like a progressive approach, which deals with problems which the less well off third of the population suffer from. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So our final story of the night moves on to the aftermath of Nicola Sturgeon's shock resignation yesterday. The SNP National Executive Committee has held a meeting to discuss the rules and a timeline for the upcoming leadership. The meeting started at 6:30, so it is ongoing as we speak, and it is likely to take a few hours. The NEC is also likely to discuss delaying the Special Democracy Conference, which was set up to lay out Sturgeon's preferred route of fighting the next general election as a de facto referendum on independence. However, if this conference should be delayed, and the ways that the leadership competition is going to function will all be decided tonight. So, John, we touched very briefly on potential candidates and who's going to be running, but is there anyone in particular that you hope to see run for the First Minister position?
I was as shocked as anybody else when Nicola Sturgeon indicated she would retire. I was really surprised, and I don't have really a strong feeling as to who should replace her. I know Angus Robertson is the bookies' favourite, and the bookies do tend to know what they're talking about a lot of the time. I'm a huge fan, a long-term fan of John Swinney. I think John Swinney is not only very intelligent, capable politician, I think he's a decent bloke. Not that common at times amongst politicians, being a decent bloke. I think he's somebody I would trust. He's been First Minister before, and maybe he wouldn't fancy it again. I don't know. Um, much is being said of Kate Forbes, obviously, and she seems very talented. I worry a little about maybe her Christian values might be something that the media would find a way to attack in some way to suggest that somehow they compromised her. I don't know. I don't have a very strong feeling because I mean, obviously, John Swinney I like a lot, but I don't know whether he'd want to do it. So I mean, I really, like everyone else, I'm waiting with interest. The other person, of course, and there's a difficulty here. The other person I'm most impressed with is Stephen Flynn, the leader in Westminster. I don't know if somehow a move could be facilitated. The Conservatives did it with Douglas Ross, moving him back. So I'm sure there could be a way. I like Stephen's manner and his ability to deal with difficult questions, and I like the fact he doesn't smile at the opposition. I'm not very happy with some of the SNP MPs down in Westminster, who seem a bit too relaxed there.
Yeah.
But he seems like somebody who's still up for a fight down there.
Yeah, that's what you need to send someone who's up for a scrap down there. You mentioned John Swinney, and he was the previous leader of the SNP, but
Yeah.
he had a pretty rough time of it when he was the leader last time. Do you think he learned anything that he could bring to this upcoming
Yeah.
leadership race?
But by my standards, he's not an old man. And there was a time when when I was a young man, most leading politicians were really quite old. I mean, what age was Churchill in the 1950s? He was in his 80s,
Hmm.
and politicians were commonly in their 60s. The top politicians, and sometimes in their 70s. So there's no real reason. And although I mean, he may feel that, and some critics may feel that he wasn't that successful. I think a lot of that was to do with media representation. I remember, well, I was a professor of media politics. Just about everything is to do with media representation. The substance behind is rarely seen because the media is more concerned with trivia and with attempts to, headhunt and to destroy and so on. So and it may be that he could come back and he may have learned from that. He's a man. He's a man who has the abilities. He's beyond the others, I'd say. There you go. So for me, John Swinney or Stephen Flynn.
Hmm. You never know, he might have been able to turn things around and have the media in his pocket this time around. You never know.
I'll be
Is
I'll be
there
accused. I'll be accused of misogyny, of course, for not choosing a woman candidate. Oh,
So there's quite a lot of youngsters, relative youngsters,
yeah.
that could be in the running. Do you think this could be, the dawn of a new era, a new generation? So we've got Mary McCallan and Humza Yousaf, all of which are kind of in their 30s. Do you think this could be a new fresh energy that could invigorate the move for independence?
Yes, I mean, some people are very mature and very able and by their 30s. And I know other people like me in their 70s who haven't got a Scooby even after all that time. So, I have nothing against the younger candidate by any means. I'm not sure which one I would choose.
And just gonna run if there's any names here. Jenny Gilruth, she's former leader. She's currently the Minister for Transport. Incredible personality. So do you think she could have the potential to follow in Nicola Sturgeon's steps? Because she was that kind of big personality. She was great with the media. She was great, very personable. Jenny Gilruth, do you think much about her?
Well, I was talking earlier about Jenny Gilruth. Her partner is Kezia Dugdale, who has since, I think, shifted quite a bit towards the SNP from her position as former Labour leader. Could it be that Jenny Gilruth and Kezia Dugdale might, between them, be able to drag those tentative independent supporters out of the Labour Party? About 30-40% of Labour supporters are pro-independence. Maybe that combination, maybe that team could drag them across. I don't know. There's lots of interesting possibilities. Jenny Gilruth does seem very impressive. I agree.
And what do you make of the current deputy leader, Keith Brown? Do you think he could be in the running? Do you see him as a potential follow-up to Nicola Sturgeon at all?
Well, I think he's one of several who seem capable.
Mm.
I don't no reason why he shouldn't. He's a perfectly credible candidate. I don't know. I don't really know that much about some of the
Mm.
details of the individuals. So I'm revealing really my lack of knowledge here by saying, well, I'm very familiar with what John Swinney has done, and I'm very
Hmm.
familiar with in recent times with the performance of Stephen Flynn at Westminster. So they've kind of forced themselves into my head. But I think I mean, as Nicola Sturgeon said, there is talent there. There's no reason why we can't find someone to come through. And also, I would say, I mean, this is something I've said in the past, that much as I was impressed by Nicola Sturgeon, my own preference is not for a charismatic leader in politics, but for a more, I come from higher education, for a more collegiate approach here, where it's not down to an individual all the time, because that's a gift to the media. demonise that independent. If that person becomes associated predominantly with the movement, then they find a way of weakening the movement through that person. But if we have a more broad, collegiate group of leaders, with someone perhaps by all means being the first minister, but not being someone who stands out above all the others all the time, then that maybe makes the party stronger, makes the government stronger.
That's actually a really interesting point, because I guess when you're trying to present the party as representing an entire movement, like a nationalist movement, and you have it based around one person, you do kind of cut yourself off and you limit yourself, because no one's going to be liked by everybody. And I guess if it's, like you were saying, a more collegiate kind of association, then you open a lot of doors that maybe Nicola Sturgeon could have closed.
Yeah, it's been too presidential, I think. The Americans have a presidential approach and like it, but Britain didn't always have a presidential approach. We've moved towards that over time, with prime ministers and first ministers being somehow identified as embodying everything that matters. And in the past, that was less so, I think. And I think I'd maybe quite like to return to that.
Well, because they are the leader of the party. They are the leader of the biggest party in Holyrood or in Westminster. They are not you're not voting for Nicola Sturgeon. You're voting for the party, which, like you were saying, British, Scottish politics has got increasingly presidential over the last kind of.
And of course, the media love that, of course, because it suits their childish approach to politics, which is to personalise everything. I mean, the media we have is much diminished, I think, from that we had in the 1960s, where issues. I mean, the Daily Record, for example, Daily Record was a perfectly respectable newspaper in the 1960s. My family took it. It was full of news. It wasn't full of celebrity culture. But now the media now have corrupted politics to an extent by pushing them towards that presidential style where it's all about individuals' appearances and whether or not they wear stiletto heels, that kind of thing. And I think we'd all benefit from a return to an emphasis on issues rather than personalities.
Yeah, absolutely. One last name. Don't know if you'll know them or not. Again, if you don't, that's completely fine. Neil Gray, have you heard much about him? He's currently the Minister for Culture and International Development. He sounds like he could be promising.
I'm going to disappoint you here. I know who he is. I don't know if I'm very sharp. I don't know if Sheriff very. No offence, Neil. And you know what's going to happen now? You know what's going to happen now? Neil Gray's going to win. The one that I don't know much about. There's a cert here. Put your money in Neil Gray. I hear he's very, very good.
He's from Orkney. From Orkney, I believe. So.
Well, you see, I'm from Berwickshire, only 10 miles north of the border with England. So I mean, I'm afraid Orkney sounds a bit kind of peripheral to me. I'm afraid.
Way too far north. But way too far north to be a Highlander and an Islander. So the rules of this. So currently, as it stands, you need 100 nominations in order to gain the ability to run for so it's from companies and from individual members, and then it's then open to people who were registered for the SNP before the cutoff date yesterday, which has raised a little bit of controversy after the mass exit from the SNP over the Gender Reform Act. Do you think that this is fair to keep the cutoff point, or do you think that the people who rage quit should be allowed back in to vote for the SNP leader?
Do we know how big the exit was? I'm not sure. I don't actually know what the figures were. I mean, certainly there was talk of a mass exodus, and there will have been an exodus, I'm sure. I don't know whether it was biblical in scale or not. But before I come to that point, as I understand it, I think you need 100 nominations, I should say, from a certain number of constituencies, and it's quite a lot of constituencies. I think it's maybe about 20 or 30 constituencies. But with modern communications technology, of course, it'd be quite easy to send emails around and try and prompt that. So that sounds quite a good thing. That sounds quite democratic, really, that you have to have support across the party. and not just in one constituency or in one area. With regard to the people who left, I'm going to take an Old Testament view of things. And my grandmother used to say to me when I disappointed her, "Hell mend you. Hell mend you." You know, if you're not with us, you're not with us. And I don't think we should be having people pop out and pop back in again.
Yeah, because it
I'll get
raises
some
the
fun.
question of loyalty to the party, loyalty to the nationalist movement, re-entryism, and everything like that, which isn't something that you necessarily want in the party,
No. I don't think so. I don't think so.
especially not in a leadership election in the party. So that's everything for this evening. Thank you so much, John, for joining me in the studio. You've been a fabulous guest. Before I go, I just want to remind you that Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who's donated and to everyone who has signed up to make regular monthly payments, thank you very much. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programs. I've been Saoirse Healey. Thank you for watching and have a lovely evening.